Welcome to the Business of Story, where we connect you with the leading minds in the art of business storytelling. Learn from best-selling authors, Hollywood screenwriters, makers, content marketers, and brand raconteurs on how to craft and sell compelling stories that sell. The Business of Story is brought to you by Oracle Marketing Cloud, helping businesses use the latest marketing technologies to tell their stories and connect with their customers. Emma, which provides innovative email marketing tools and services that drive brilliant results. Act Content Management Software, organizing all your prospect details in one place so you can prioritize your day and market more effectively. And by Convince and Convert, digital marketing advisors and counselors to leading brands and organizations worldwide. Convince and Convert helps you gain and keep your customers online. Here's your host, Park Howell.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another exciting edition of the Business of Story. I am your host, Park Howell, and it is my job to introduce you and connect you with story artists from around the world to help you craft and tell compelling brand stories that sell. And today's show is no different. We have a dude that is going to blow your mind. He is a master storyteller, author, and story consultant. His name is Kendall Haven. Now, Kendall has written 2 seminal books that have revolutionized our understanding of stories and especially how stories work in our minds. His acclaimed book, Story Proof, The Science Behind the Startling Power of Story, presents the first ever proof that story structure is an information delivery system powerhouse. Then his follow-on book, Story Smart, Using the Science of Story to Persuade, Inspire, Influence, and Teach, lays out the latest neuro and cognitive research on story engagement, story power, empathy, influence, and the process for merging your themes and messages into effective, powerful story architecture. Now, here's the thing. The business stories that you intend to use to influence your customers first must pass through a filter Kendall calls the Neuro Story Net. Now, we all have one of these Neuro Story Nets. It's in our subconscious, and it filters the stories we see and hear through our memories, and then fabricates a whole new story based on our past experiences and perceptions. So essentially, we make up stories that are complete fiction from what the storyteller intended. Now, have you seen this happen with your brand stories? But no worries, there is hope. On today's episode of Business of Story, Kendall will teach us a simple method he calls sentence, picture, emotion that helps hack the hardwiring of the brain to get our stories through. Plus, you'll learn a breadcrumb trail approach to help you think in story form called, wait for it, blank, wanted, because, but, so, finally. Yeah, we'll fill in the blanks there. And why does this story form work? Because this is the story structure our brains seek to create meaning out of the madness around us. And finally, I got a question for you. Which kind of stories do you think do a better job of moving people to action? Ones with positive endings or negative endings? Comedy or tragedy? Let's find out. Kendall, welcome to Business of Story. It's great to have you here.
And it's great to be here.
Well, you have been at this storytelling for a long time. And I can say that because I think you and I are like the peers of about the same age. So I've been at the communications world a long time, but really my heart into storytelling in the past 12 to 15 years. You've been doing it, you've been studying it, and going back to what, West Point?
Well, West Point, of course, isn't a fan of what we would call story, or what they would call story. But actually, in hindsight, looking back on it and looking back on the military, sure, it plays very much into story. I really got into story after I got my doctorate in oceanography and was at Lawrence Berkeley Lab leading a little science team for the Department of Energy, and started to take a nephew who was 4 going on 5 at the time to the park every now and then to play, and would after a while sit in the sandbox and make up stories for him, and noticed consistently time after time. And this is back in the early 80s before cell phones. So if someone was sitting in the sandbox talking, no one assumed they were talking on the phone. The assumption was they're talking to people around them. And so time after time, we would draw crowds, not of just kids, but of adults. And I started to watch the adults who would wander over to listen to these little made up stories. No guarantee the story is going anywhere. And the conclusion I came to was it was obvious to me that they listened differently because they thought it was a story. And
the adults listen differently?
You could see them lean in. It was like I was a gravity well, and they're walking by on the sidewalk with suits on and briefcases in their hands, obviously going somewhere fairly important. And you could see them kind of lean in and slow down. Adults would stop to listen to the stories. And it hit me that if I was sitting in the sandbox reading any of the reports that I thought I was paid reasonably good money for by the federal government, they wouldn't stop and listen. That somehow, as soon as they perceived that it was a story, they paid attention differently. Now I can go into a lab, EEG lab, and I can show it to you. As soon as it's a story, as soon as you perceive it's a story you're listening to, there are whole different aspects of the brain, parts of your brain that light up, that don't light up if the same information is provided outside of story form. We listen to stories with additional parts of our brain than we listen to the same information coming other ways, which means that the images that get into our conscious mind and into our memory when we think it's a story are more vivid, more detailed, and therefore, according to the research, far more likely to be recalled accurately and acted upon, which is where business starts to be interested in story, because that's what any business wants with its messaging, is you want it to be accurately filed into memory with sufficient vivid detail so that it is likely to be recalled and acted on.
Does this come back to that idea? And I think of Jonathan Gottschall, the author of The Storytelling Animal, and using one of his quotes where he says, "The human mind yields helplessly to the suction of story." And I think about when people say, "Oh, he's out of his mind," or it had a mind of its own. It seems to me that the neurology, the hardwiring of our brains, does have a mind of its own. When it hears story, it seems to pique its interest, and we have little or no control over it initially. Is that kind of what you think you were experiencing out there in the park?
Yes, except at the time, and this is now 33 years ago, I had neither the vocabulary nor the concepts to express it. Now I can say exactly why that happens. What reaches your conscious mind is not at all what reached your sensory organs, eyes or ears. When you experience something, when you see something, when you read something, what reaches your conscious mind, well, consider this. You read a page of text. You're not aware of your mind converting black and white images into lines and spaces, converting those lines into letters, letters into words. It just happens. It happens in the subconscious part of the mind automatically. In the same way, you're not aware of your mind converting that information as it comes in into story form before it reaches your conscious mind. And that's something we were able to demonstrate and establish doing some work in advanced EEG labs and testing a whole lot of test audiences. What reaches your conscious mind initially is your own self-created story-based version of what reached your sensory organs, eyes or ears, and you distort it and change it so that it makes sense to you. And that is a story-based process, which is why different people can watch the same event and come away with different versions of it, which is why different people can watch the same ad or the same movie and have radically different reactions to it. It's because what reached their conscious mind, what they act on, what reaches your conscious mind is different because what reaches the conscious mind is that self-created version of it. And that's where stories come to play, because that whole process is story-based. Understand the elements of story the process of story, and you have a chance to control at least what reaches the conscious mind of your audience, which is what any business is after.
Okay, so then I've got a question for you. We cover this, I've talked about this before on Business of Story, and I talk about it in my class at ASU. And a lot of times, Kendall, I will get business professionals, content marketers, they'll say, yeah, okay, whatever, let me just get back to writing and cranking out my content. And in this day and age of SEO, in trying to get your content found online, we tend to lean and default towards all those SEO terms that are very technical and mechanical in their own right, because we're gaming the SEO system, which, in my opinion, can get in the way of telling a good story. So why should business people care, and why should content marketers care that they should be paying a little bit of attention to story and story structure in the communications they push out?
I'd say there are two reasons. First, as I mentioned, it's because every person who reads or sees your material is going to interpret it, not so much consciously, but at a subconscious level. They'll interpret it in story form and in story terms. And if you don't anticipate those story elements, you lose control of how each individual interprets and makes sense out of your own material. There was some research done, this is now 4.5, 5 years ago, on marketing by nonprofits. And it showed that on this research project, 30% of all of the messaging, the ads that nonprofits put out, were actually counterproductive. That is to say, more often than not, they wound up hurting rather than helping the cause that those nonprofits were trying to promote. Why? Because they didn't stop and think, how is my audience going to interpret this information? How are they going to make sense out of it? As soon as it made sense to them, and anything they said would make sense to them, they put it out, and then were dumbfounded to find that it hurt more than it helped. Understanding story structure lets you vastly reduce the number of people who will misinterpret your information. Second, human beings are drawn to story. And you've had a whole lot of people on this program that have said that. We are naturally drawn to story because that's the way our brains literally are hardwired to make sense of the world around us. So when information comes in story form, and again, this has been tested and can be established through an experiment, the imagery that forms in your mind is more vivid and more detailed if that information came in story form than it otherwise would be. And there's been a lot of research on memory and recall that has shown that the density of sensory detail linked to any memory is directly proportional to the likelihood that you will be able to accurately remember it and act on it at some future time. That's what every business wants. So coming at it two different ways. One is to have your message accurately get into the conscious mind. That's a function of story structure and the elements of story structure. And then to create the images in the mind that go into memory that will drive recall is also story-based. So those people who say, well, just put your messages out there, rely on either intuitive ability or on luck to be able to connect with the conscious minds and memories of their audience. And that works for some, but for most of us, I think you do a lot better if you stop and consciously consider those elements, especially now that we can identify what they are, because we can go into a lab and test them and demo them.
And Kendall, when you're talking about story form, what do you mean, or what exactly is the right algorithm for story form, if there is such a thing?
And here, I'll answer it this way. We can identify those specific narrative elements that the conscious mind or the subconscious mind is hardwired to use in its attempt to make sense out of incoming information. So those are the elements that you have to get through in order to reach the conscious mind, because this subconscious processing, this neural story net that lies in the lower back part of the brain, lies between sensory organs and the conscious mind. And through a lot of testing, what we were able to show is it's looking for a very few specific bits of information. One, character positions. There are a couple of specific character positions it assumes will be represented in the material, and it tries to force all available story characters into those positions: main character, antagonist, the climax character, that character that has the power to determine how the climax scene comes out. Each of those has goal, what they are after, what they need or want to do or get in the story, motive that explains why that goal is important. Then a character has to face some combination of problems and conflict that block the character from having already reached the goal, that create risk, the likelihood of failure, and danger, the consequences of failure. Those two then control excitement and tension in the story. And then we want to watch a character struggle. Ultimately, we want to watch a character we care about struggle to get past problems and conflicts, facing risk and danger, to get to a goal that's important to them and relevant to us. And that's those two last things come from the motive. And then we want to see it in sufficient sensory detail so that we can visualize it in our minds as if we were really there watching it. That's it. Those are the few basic elements that the neural story net inside each human's brain uses to make sense out of incoming information. The bits that typically get omitted when businesses try to put out their messaging, goals and motives, and the research shows that if you leave those out, what is a character going after? Not what do they do, but what are they after? And particularly, why are they after? Why is it important to them? Leave those two out, and the vast majority of any audience will assume that your characters and you, being the person presenting the material, have far more self-oriented, even sarcastic, even narcissistic motives, and therefore look far more with far more reluctance and far more suspicion on the story and the characters than was intended. So a lot of times when people react negatively to a story, to communication of any kind, it's because the person doing the communication didn't include those key bits. What am I after in presenting this information? What are the people I'm talking about after? And why is it important to them? And why is that relevant to you, my audience? And if you don't include that information, they wind up assuming that your motives are far more self-serving and negative to the audience than they really are.
So very interesting. That neural net that you talked about is automatically back there scanning in the stimuli of the story coming in, and it's looking for these major traits. You said the character position, so it wants both the protagonist or the hero of the story and the antagonist who they have to overcome.
Well, let's not call him a hero. There's a main character. The main character is the character whose goal is resolved at the end of the story. The character of the story is about. That may or may not be the hero. Often in a story, there's another character who steps up at the climax scene, at the important moment in the story, and is the one who determines how the story really plays out. You and I are both old enough to think back in Westerns. Westerns used to dominate TV and movies back in the 50s and early 60s. Think of a Western wagon train heading out across the prairie. We'll be real simple. John Wayne is leading he's the guy leading the wagon train, and they are attacked by Indians. They circle up the wagons. Indians are firing flaming arrows, and the wagons are on fire. People are getting shot. You think, oh no, they're all going to die. And at the last possible minute, you hear a little, and you see these little pendants right up over the hill, and here comes the cavalry to save the day. The cavalry isn't the main character in that story. John Wayne is. But they are the climax character, that character that has the power to determine how that final scene in the story plays out. That final confrontation between the main character and the obstacles that stand between them and their goal. The hero, we call that character a hero when it plays out, when the story plays out as we in the audience would like it to play out. We call that character, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can wind up coming out very negatively for the main character and for the other, and for us, the audience in the story. In which case, it's a tragedy, and that character that predominates, that finally dominates the scene, is the antagonist, or often it can be that character, and that's a very effective messaging system, because if a story ends positively, it doesn't tend to spur immediate action by the audience. If a story ends terribly, horribly, unacceptably, if it causes you to be outraged, it tends to spur you to immediate action. That's the way you get a riot in the street. If you want to create a riot in the street, is have a story end in the mind and viewpoint of the audience terribly wrong. If it ends positively, it tends not to spur immediate action. It can change long-term attitudes and values, but only long-term values that tend to show up months or years into the future.
Mm-hmm. So the brain's looking for these characters that have a goal. They're trying to get something, and they're motivated, and it's a motivation that's relevant to the character and that the audience can appreciate, and I suppose even live vicariously through. There's conflict. There's, the universe pushes back, as it always does to all of us when you're out trying to seek something, which creates excitement, reveals more of the character depth of how do they overcome this.
One note on that. It's amazing how often when I talk to people in business or in government agencies, how reticent they are to include problems and conflicts in the story, almost as if somehow they're not supposed to have problems and conflicts. That's an admission of a weakness. Call them, if you want, challenges, obstacles. The vocabulary you use isn't important. The concept is, we want to get across that something has to stand between who we are, if we're the main character, and what we're after. And the more noble, the more appealing the goal is, the more the audience is going to identify with that main character and root for them. There's always some reason why the main character hasn't always already achieved the goal. It may be need more time to do research. It may be need more money to be able to fund some activity. Whatever it is, it's always there. And it's amazing how many groups are reluctant to explore the potential and the power of including those conflicts and problems or obstacles, whatever word you want to use, and the associated risk and danger. Yet they're the ones that control story tension and much of the story emotion that's critical to fully engaging an audience.
Well, Kendall, after these messages from our sponsors, let's explore that a little bit because I would like to understand more about your background with the neuroscientist story, what you just took us through in this story development of story form, and let our listeners, the businesses, know out there, how can they employ this immediately? What can they do tomorrow or right after listening to this to start having more impact with the messaging that they are sending out? So let's cover that right after these messages. Are you keeping track of sales leads in a spreadsheet? Or worse, Post-it notes all over your desk? Well, there's a better way, and it doesn't involve spending a fortune on complex CRM software. For over 25 years, ACT has been the #1 best-selling contact and customer management software. It's super affordable and easy to use. ACT helps individuals, small businesses, and sales teams organize prospect and customer details in one place. It helps market products and services more effectively, and most importantly, ACT drives sales. So try ACT free for 30 days by visiting actstory.com and sign up for a chance to win a pair of Bose Quiet Comfort 20i acoustic noise canceling headphones, a $299 value. Again, that's actstory.com. Hey, I've got a question for you. What's the best call to action button color on your website? Yeah, you probably didn't see that one coming, did you? Well, what's the best shape and sizes of your CTA buttons? And what copy gets more clicks? These questions have interrupted my sleep patterns for weeks now, until I downloaded a helpful new email marketing guide from Emma called Why We Click: The Psychology Behind a Great Call to Action. You'll learn how applying just a little bit of brain science can transform your CTA buttons into small but mighty conversion powerhouses. It covers the button color, copy, and placement that helps skyrocket click rates. Check it out at myemma.com/click. Emma helps marketers everywhere send smart, stylish email newsletters, promotions, and automated campaigns, and help us all rest a little easier knowing our email marketing is doing its job. So check out their new publication at myemma.com/click. Welcome back to Business of Story, and our guest today, Kendall Haven, who is a master storyteller, author, and story consultant to businesses, governments, and everything in between. Kendall's also has 2 really fascinating books, Story Smart, using the science of story to persuade, influence, inspire, and teach, and Story Proof, the science behind the startling power of story. I get startling and starting mixed up in my own way. That must be my neural net at work and doing all the wrong things. But Kendall, thanks for being here with us on Business of Story. And you took us through that very fascinating story form of character and goal and motivation, and then conflict arises, or the euphemisms in business of challenges and obstacles. What happens to that main character pushing through, and then the end result of what they achieve with their goal that is important to them and very relevant to us, because after all, as the audience, we are living vicariously through these characters to try on trouble to see what we would do just in case it happens to us. Now, that's all really fascinating, and I know Hollywood knows this well, and neuroscience folks like yourself know this well. Why is it important to business, and how can we use it immediately? Like right after listening to this, if I want to go out and write my tweet or a blog post or create a campaign or put together a PowerPoint presentation, why do I care about all this, and how can I use it?
Again, why you care is because once we've established that neural story net exists in the human brain, and that our brains are evolutionarily hardwired and pre-programmed to make sense of the world in story terms, then that neural story net and its processing, which acts at a subconscious level in the brain and lies between the outside world and the conscious mind of your target audience, it really forms an obstacle you have to get past if you're going to get your messaging accurately, vividly into the conscious mind and memory of your target audience. You don't have the option to get into their brain some other way. So the idea then is, what can you do to take advantage of it right away? First, each person, I said this before, each person creates a self-created, story-based version of your material. That is, say, the material you provide that gets to their sensory organs, eyes, ears. And that's what reaches their conscious mind, that self-created version, which is a story-based version. Well, partly we're able to show that people warp and distort your information an amazing amount in order to make it make sense to them as part of that process. The question is, how do they do that? Well, they do it by literally in less than a heartbeat, dredging up from their past experiences, their prior knowledge, all of their beliefs, their attitudes, things they know that are right, things they know that are wrong, their past experiences, their past learning. What's the most likely sets of information to make what you provided make sense to them? That means that everything that you provide is distorted some by your audience based on what their attitudes, their beliefs, their issues, their concerns, what they know, what they don't know. All right. So there is no such thing as a universally effective story. Every effective story is target audience specific. So how do you start? Acknowledge first that neural story net exists and that it uses the prior knowledge of each individual in order to manipulate and warp and distort your information to make it make sense to the individual. That's called audience modeling. Figure out who is your audience and think about figure out ahead of time, research who they are, what their issues are, what their background is, what do they know. And that gives you some clues as to how they're going to interpret your information. Second, know that any story, any ad gets across a simple message, period. I've worked with some groups, admittedly more nonprofits and government agencies than business groups, who in a single presentation said, well, here are the 15 points I really need to get across. And they're not going to get any points across. If you had to sum up in one sentence the thought that you want to plant in every mind in your target audience, what would it be? Keep it simple, declarative sentence, not complex, not compound sentence. And then say, when someone recalls that thought, that one simple sentence, what picture do I want to have in their mind? What picture comes up with it? Our brains are very good at remembering sensory images, pictures, sights, sounds. We're not very good at remembering words. So if you link an image, usually it's visual, but it could be a sound if you wanted. But a sensory image, if you can link that sensory image with those words, then the likelihood that they'll be accurately filed into memory and recalled goes way up. Next, how do you want your target audience to feel when they recall that picture and that sentence? Our research has shown that you will never fully engage an audience, and you need to fully engage them in order to influence them, which is what you're after, unless you involve them at an emotional level. Stories do that. They engage people at an emotional level. So you have those three little bits then. A bumper sticker kind of a phrase, a sentence that you want to plant in their minds, a picture, an image that goes with it, and an emotion that you want them to feel when they recall that picture and that sentence. Now, that's then the genesis point for a story. Knowing full well that your audience is going to interpret your message in story form, then you say, well, who is the character? What kind of a character will my target audience most easily identify with and follow? Is it themselves? Is it someone like them? Is it Um, you know, who is it, and then think, okay, in my presentation, what are they after, and why, and use that why, the motive. It's called motive matching. Have the characters in your story act for motives that you know will match the core values and beliefs, motives of your target audience. And every time, the target audience will then start to identify with that character, that viewpoint. Um, so now you've got the start of a story. Then the question is, how do you want the story to end? Do you want it to end well? Do you want it to end poorly for that character? Depending on how you want to spur the actions, the influence that you want to exert on your target audience. Having done that, then all you have to do is flesh out, well, what happens during this story between the time that I present a character and the time that we get to that resolution point that I've defined. But the heart of it is to always use as a check, will my character, will my story promote that one sentence, that one image, and that one emotional state that I want to link together? Usually that winds up being integrally tied into the way the story ends. Those three, so that they are the final image and sensation that people get from the story. If they start, it's so that story, more than the physical thing. Once upon a time there was, or I want to tell you a story about, forget the physical thing. Think of story as an approach, a planning approach to your material. So you want to account in the way you plan your material for how your target audience is going to interpret and make sense out of it. Because they're going to. And what you're after is the version that finally gets to their conscious mind after they've initially made sense of it. So that's
And Kendall,
the
it seems
story
like
thinking.
in our line of work in communications and so forth that we are taught how to write and to artists to draw, and depict these scenes in a number of different ways, narrative and graphically. But we are very rarely trained about trying to understand our audience so that we are
Yeah.
telling the stories that model their behavior and share and connect their values. How do you recommend that people go about truly understanding the audience they're writing for in the first place?
The hardest part is figuring out who it is you're writing for. And so often we say, well, pretty much the general public. And yet, if you go to a marketing firm or an ad agency, they have gotten pretty good at doing target market analysis, breaking down the market. What are they after? What drives them? What are their buying trends? What are the issues that are their trigger points? It's all of that information, and they've just drifted in that direction because it has proven to be very valuable to the success rate of their campaigns, the campaigns that they have created for some client. Uh, to the extent that you have or can create that kind of market analysis, call it, I'd call it audience profiling, but that's gotten a real bad rap, those words. But that's what you're trying to do, is write a profile of your target audience, which includes what are their issues, what are their concerns, what's going to draw their attention, what's going to instantly make them see that what I'm talking about is relevant to them. That's market analysis, and that gives you then access for, how do I word that core takeaway message, that one little sentence? How do I word that so that my target audience will instantly see that it's relevant, that it has context for their lives and their issues? By the time you've done that, you're 2/3 of the way toward victory, because the rest of it is, it's not mechanical, but it certainly is more mechanical in that we now know the elements, the informational elements of story that audiences and their neural story nets respond to.
And it seems like in our line of work, too, the professional services firms, B2B marketing, are particularly challenged by telling stories that they seem to lead with features and benefits that has very little compelling reason for people to engage with and really pay attention to. And maybe you see this in government and you do a lot of work in science. I know, my friend Randy Olson, who wrote Houston, We Have a Narrative, is all about trying to teach scientists how to tell stories through his and, but, and therefore construct. But anything that these particular types of firms too can be doing immediately. I know you talked about the story form here, but what would be like the number one thing for them to do next to really start indoctrinating story into their lives?
Well, since you mentioned it, before I answer that question, let me add in, I often get asked, can you simplify those elements? Can you simplify it? Can you make it easier and still make it true to what research shows the human brain is wired to do, to make sense out of it? And I would, here's as simple as I can do mine. Blank, an interesting character, wanted blank, that would be goal, because blank, motive, but this is conflicts and problems, risk and danger. So now we get to the action, the struggles, and finally come back to resolve the goal. So it's blank character, wanted blank, because blank, but blank, so blank the action, finally back to resolve the character. And that's as simple as I've been able to make it and still be true to what we know from research about that neural story net. What's the thing to do first is don't start with the story. The story is the servant. The story is the delivery vehicle. That's what stories engage. The elements of story are what make people sit up and pay attention. But it's not the story usually that you want them to pay attention to. Ultimately, it's some messaging that you want to deliver through the story. If you start with the story, you'll never get the messaging in an effective way. If you start by thinking of who's my target audience and what's the thing I want to get to them, and then let that drive the story. I mean, as a storyteller, I always think story is the most important thing in the world, but in truth, for businesses, the story isn't. The story is just a vehicle to engage an audience and hold that engagement. And what does that is characters struggling to get something, to achieve some goal that's important to them and valuable and relevant to us, the audience. Then the more they struggle, the more conflict and problems they have, the greater the tension is, the greater the excitement in the story is. That's all good. But at its heart, characters who struggle to get something that is important to them and of value and relevance to us, that's the heart and soul of a story that will engage an audience and give you an opportunity to insert some messaging that usually goes into how that story plays out and what happens at the resolution point of the story. It's what that messaging is that's most important. The people that stumble most in making effective stories, I think, jump into the story too soon, and so wallow in is it a good story? Is it a bad story? Does it work? Doesn't it work? Because they haven't set up that criteria, that sort of a metric ahead of time that says, here's the point I want my story to make. And then if you have that clearly stated, what's that takeaway message? What's the picture that goes with it? The image that goes with it? What's the emotion that goes with it? Then it's easy later to look at the story and say, does it succeed at delivering effectively that triad of the takeaway message? Yes or no? Then you have a metric for evaluating your story. without that, what do people use? Well, how many hits did it get on YouTube? Or how many Twitter feeds does it get? But I don't think those translate very well into commercial success, not nearly as well as knowing whether or not a story will accurately deliver the takeaway message and that image that goes with it. And so it seems to me, above all else, is the place to start, and let the stories come later as the servant of that messaging.
Excellent. So to recap on this particular section, then, you want to have a communication in the form of a story that is the vehicle that your audience can sum up in one sentence, can create a visual picture in their mind of what you're talking about and attach an emotion to it. And that typically starts with finding very much the human element within this narrative. Don't be thinking about the story first. And I liked how you broke this down. So blank or so-and-so wanted such and such because of this, but then the universe pushes back. So you have your big but. So they had to do this and overcome their struggle to finally achieve this. And that's the achieving of the goal that is important to them, but relevant to your audience.
Well, yes, but more generally, you can say the resolution of the goal, because there are times you may want to have a story end where the character fails and have it be a cautionary tale for the audience to then take away saying, well, I want to act differently than that character did. Mm-hmm. So we often tend to negate the value of the cautionary tale, but they are very powerful. And a good cautionary tale requires that characters fail.
Well, that goes back to your concept of people don't necessarily react as powerfully to a positive ending as they do to a negative ending. So that could be the cautionary tale you're speaking of.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Kendall, let us take one more break. And when we come back, I'd like to wrap up the show here talking about your two books, because I think they're fascinating. And I'm curious what we can all pull from them. That's Story Smart and Story Proof, kind of the science behind why all this works, and a bit of a user guide for us. So let's talk about that right after this. Hey, if you like what you're hearing here on Business of Story, then you are going to love Definitive, the email from Convince and Convert that many marketers say is the most useful resource around. Each day, the team at Convince and Convert picks a topic and sends you the 3 best resources ever created about that topic. It's topical, it's timely, it's useful, so go to definitivedigest.com and subscribe for free right now. To tell effective business stories means to truly understand your audience, beckon them in with a story they care about, convert them into a customer, and then nurture that relationship for lifelong brand bonding. That's not always easy to do, but marketing automation has made it easier than ever. The challenge is, how do you take all that data and turn it into drama? Well, the marketing gods over at Oracle Marketing Cloud have done that for us. They've created this easy-to-read and easy-to-digest guide called Marketing Automation Simplified Guide. It offers an introduction to the 5 tenets of modern marketing and breaks down the tips marketers need to know to automate and optimize. This includes data in targeting, email marketing, lead nurturing, lead scoring, content marketing, and sales enablement. So to get your free Oracle Marketing Cloud guide, Marketing Automation Simplified, go to bit.ly/Oracle Automation. That's bit.ly/Oracle Automation, and start getting your brand story straight. Welcome back to Business of Story. In our guest today, a fascinating guest, Kendall Haven, who is a master storyteller and author of 2 really amazing books that we're going to talk about right now, and a story consultant. So, Kendall, you've got these 2 books, and by the way, you can go to Kendall's site at kendallhaven.com, and that's Kendall, Kendall, Haven, Haven.com. Now, Kendall, you've taken the time, you've explored this, and you've got Story Smart, and the line below it says, the step-by-step user's guide to neuro and cognitive science that controls story engagement and influence. Now that sounds like, whoa, that's blowing my mind as a creative individual that just wants to write clever stories. But how do I use these books to become better at business communication?
A quick example that comes out of understanding how the human brain is wired to work. The science isn't the endpoint. The science is just there to reveal how the brain works so that people can then use it for their own purposes. If I said to you, as an example, once there was a girl named Mary who wanted some ice cream. I've just mentioned a character and a goal, what she wants to do or get in the story. How do you think the story is going to end? Only knowing the opening sentence, once there was a girl named Mary who wanted some ice cream.
It could end any way it wants. Your brain, I suppose it ends in how I experienced it.
So the ending is, and Mary's brother John became class president at the end.
Okay.
And you would probably say, no, wait. What happened to Mary and her ice cream? If I set up a character and a goal, in your mind, you expect me to resolve it. Not because the world works that way, but because that neural story net expects it. In fact, the neural story net demands it. And if I said, once there was a girl named Mary who really wanted some ice cream, went on with the story and didn't tell you anything about the ice cream, at some level you would feel very cheated and incomplete because I set up a goal and never resolved it. So what does that tell you in a practical way? If you want people to expect a certain kind of a direction for your material, expect where it's going to go, all you have to do is set up a character and a goal that leads your audience to that resolution point. Why? Because we expect that goals get resolved in story-based material. So knowing that, I get to control where you think the story is going, what you expect to have happen at the end. That lets me control influence. If I set up what you are looking for, then I can either deliver it or fail to, or intentionally not deliver it, but it lets me control influence. What I try to do in these books is say, because of recent advances in medical imaging, that is, say, EEG machines and fMRI, we can learn a lot that for 2,000 years, we can specify a lot that for 2,000 years people have had to guess at. Why? Because all we care about is what happens inside the human brain. Every time you want to communicate anything to anyone, what you care about is what happens inside their brain. But we can't go there. So we have to look for surrogates to use as a metric on whether or not we were successful. Not so much anymore. In the last dozen years, we've been able to look inside the human brain and watch your brain on story. And what I wanted to put in this book is the background behind it, and that's a lot of story proof, is the background research that lies behind this understanding to give you a sense of how the brain in general works. And then how do you use it? And that's more of the Story Smart book, is how do you take that and turn it around and say, all right, I want to create story-based material that is consistently effective and consistently creates the response in an audience that I intended.
So in essence, you're creating brain story surgeons.
Yeah. Very good. I like that.
It just occurred to me. I'm now a brain scientist or a brain surgeon, but in story.
I've had one person call me the neural storyteller, and I liked it, but I wasn't quite sure exactly what it meant. But yeah, really, we're now every business, every organization now has the potential to very consciously, consistently construct, edit, revise, and check all of their messaging from the viewpoint of knowing what's going to happen inside the mind of their target audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty new. And that's what's exciting about this work. And that's what I've tried to lay out in those two books.
Essentially, it allows us to hack influence by understanding the hardwiring of the brain and this neural net for storytelling. And when I hate to say it, but it's really manipulate that with the stories we do, but use it for good, not evil, you can have tremendous subconscious impact on folks.
Sure. But that's nothing new. That's what stories have been used for thousands of years. The deal is now it lets you use it in a positive way more consistently. And also, I believe, the more we become aware of how stories work and the science behind them, the more you start to recognize someone who is really trying to manipulate your brain, because the techniques and the tools are all story-based and get to be pretty easy to recognize.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess it really comes down to we've known that stories have worked since the beginning of time, but now we know why they work. Science has allowed us to peek into the brain and go, oh, we're highlighting or we're firing up these regions of the brain, connecting these as we are all meaning-making machines. And then, like you said, if we can really understand our audiences and what they want and share with them a story that as a brand or a business helps them achieve their goal, empower them, wrap that in and deliver it in a story that makes sense to them as relevant to them, then you can have really some amazing power out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of examples of when and how it has worked. And often it's been sort of catch as catch can, or just someone stumbled onto a good story. And that's great when it happens. But you can also now be much more methodically consistent in making those kind of success stories happen.
Yeah, amazing information. So thank you, Kendall, for being here on Business of Story. I mean, really, really important work and fascinating for how we in the business communication realm can have a big impact on our audiences. And again, if you would like to learn more about Kendall and his work, go to kendallhaven.com. That's with 2 L's, kendallhaven.com, and his 2 incredible books, Story Proof, followed by Story Smart. So Story Proof essentially is the science behind this. Story Smart is the user guide of how to use the science to be able to become a more compelling business story strategist and storyteller.
Right.
All right.
And story strategist is also a word I like. I like that too.
Yeah, story strategies, I do too. It really comes down to you have to get your ducks in a row before you're out there sharing a bunch of stories. But we really, really appreciate you being with us today. And we'd like to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to this edition of Business of Story. And if you would like to learn more about Business of Story, the tools that we have on the website and other podcasts of some amazing guests like Kendall, please visit businessofstory.com. And if you like what you're hearing, go to iTunes and please give us a rating. That always helps us to push our storytelling world out to the rest of the world. And let us know if there's anything that you would like to be hearing on the show. Please feel free to shoot me an email at park@businessofstory.com. So thank you again for listening, and be sure to tune in next Wednesday when we will have another amazing story artist, or dare I say, a brain surgeon storyteller with us on Business of Story. So until next Wednesday, have a wonderful life.
Thanks for tuning in to the Business of Story. Don't forget there are terrific free storytelling resources for you at thebusinessofstory.com, where you'll also find the complete show archive. The Business of Story is sponsored by Oracle Marketing Cloud, Emma, ACT, and by Convince and Convert, and is produced by Convince and Convert Media. Find more great shows like The Business of Story at marketingpodcasts.com, the first search engine for marketing podcasts.